Welcome to a Climate Conversation podcast. This is a podcast series that we've started to complement the documentary A Climate Conversation, which was really the vision and project of Walt Johnson. He's a geophysicist, and he just wanted to have an honest conversation with experts regarding this whole narrative around climate. And so we're very excited today. We've got a big show planned for you, and we have Walt Johnson in his studio, and we've got Dave O'Rourke, who is our spokesperson for A Climate Conversation, and very honored to have Dr. Judith Curry. She is the author of Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. And so welcome. It's great to have all of you here. And Dave, I know you've really done a tremendous amount of research regarding Dr. Curry's work. So where do you want to start on this?
Well, I would always favor hearing, the background. I hear Dr. Curry's background and how she got here and what sort of prompted the book. But the things that leaped out at me, and, we've been diving into this conversation here now for months, is Dr. Curry's come up with a couple of distinct questions I think need to be asked. And since the milieu here is a conversation, I'm really fascinated to hear a disquisition on the distinction between climate change and climate variability. Now, we have a real scientist about this, and I think that is maybe the biggest single thing that we should be talking about, get our definitions right before we blow up the world. And second, the idea of trying to shoehorn a global solution into what appears to be a set of regional problems. I think you've uncovered a couple of really important topics here. So any way you'd like to start, Dr. Curry, would be great.
Okay, well, those are two key issues. I mean, the first one, you have climate change. Everybody knows what it is. There's a simple narrative that's been put out there. It's warming. We're causing it, from fossil fuel emissions. It's dangerous. Therefore, we need to eliminate fossil fuel emissions. Well, all this flies in the face of our understanding of how the climate system works. I mean, the geological definition of climate change relates to a whole myriad of factors: the sun, volcanic eruptions, large-scale ocean circulations, geological processes, in the Earth's crust. Humans influence the climate in a number of ways, land use being really the most obvious one, cutting down forests, replacing it with agriculture, urbanization, lots of things like that do influence the local climate. But climate change has now been defined by the United Nations, even under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to be related to human-caused climate change, specifically related to emissions. Okay, and so all of that other stuff, volcanoes, the sun, everything else is lumped into climate variability. But you never hear anybody talking about climate variability, just about climate change. And the UN's redefinition of climate change for political purposes have completely marginalized the whole issue of natural climate variability and change. So everybody thinks that anything that happens to the weather and the climate is caused by CO2 emissions. Which is just not the case.
Even arson in Hawaii, apparently, it's remarkable. No matter where you are, or no matter how many hurricanes have gone through tornadoes have gone through Kansas. Apparently, they go through Kansas now because of something that I had for breakfast or how I got to work, as opposed to whatever it was that used to cause those tornadoes going through Kansas for the last, millennia.
The linking of climate change, fossil fueled climate change to extreme weather events is critical for propaganda purposes, because nobody cares about the slow creep of warming. oh, a degree or two, who cares? The difference from night to day and summer to winter and equator to pole is way greater than a few degrees. Why should we care about a few degrees? But once you tie a few degrees of warming to worsening extreme weather events, okay, then you've got people's attention. But the thing is that we're in a fairly benign period of weather, in the 21st century. Things were really worse in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. The 1930s were a period of a horrendous, bad extreme weather, the worst droughts, the worst heat waves, the worst fires, forest fires, and even the worst U.S. landfalling hurricanes. So blaming current extreme weather events on climate change is not supported by the evidence. And even the UN climate assessments find little to no evidence of any link to the warming other than increased intensity of heat waves. All of the other things, tornadoes, floods, droughts, hurricanes, and so forth, there's no relationship to global warming, human caused or otherwise.
Well, Kim, I want to hand it back to you. I know you've got I don't want to dominate our early conversation here. I've got a lot of questions that I hope to get to.
Well, I know that you do. And Dr. Curry, it seems though that these weather events are being used, they're put out, all over the news. People fire up their computers and they see all of this, these weather events, and it's really then being used to, as you said, for political purposes, to ultimately, I think, try to control everyday people's lives. And but I think that people are starting to pay attention. Of course, you've been in this arena and shedding light on this, but I think more and more people are starting to question it. Or what do you think?
Well, I think peak climate craziness was, say, 2021. I think we're slowly turning the corner. Particularly this last year, we had, in 2023, we had this huge spike in global temperature. It brought us over the 1.5 degree threshold for reasons that had nothing to do with CO2 emissions, but people said, okay, nothing terrible happened. Are we overreacting here? So people are just, there's too much doom and gloom, and people really don't see things as being all that bad. I mean, the whole point of amping up the alarm over extreme weather events and all these targets, temperature targets, emission targets, is to amp up the political pressure to eliminate fossil fuel emissions for reasons that have little to do with climate change. Because even if we were somehow successful at reaching net zero, I mean, we're not going to change the climate on the time scale of the 21st century. So, that little, even the climate models tell us that. So, that there's big political agendas, and a big part of trying to get people to go along with this is to scare them. I mean, this is classical propaganda techniques.
Well, it certainly is. And Walt, in some of the notes that Dave had sent over, you had some commentary on that you indicated that you and Dr. Curry were on maybe a similar journey as you were looking at this issue.
Yes, I think a lot of people have been. And Dr. Curry almost sounded apologetic when someone asked her why she hadn't seen all this before. She said, well, I haven't had all the data. And all of that is true, but I go back to the 90s, let's say, and you can see it from statistics. Most of the country in the US was starting to build gas-fired power plants, not because it was cheaper. They were about comparable cost-wise, but close. But people would spend a little more, if need be, to put a gas-fired power plant because we were hearing the CO2 is bad for us. And without laws or government regulations, our country was converting to use more natural gas, and we were lowering our CO2 output. We were the only country that was. And then as things changed, and at the time, I spent a lot of time, could we meet the Kyoto Protocol with this? And yes, most people thought we could. We looked at the gas reserves in the U.S. If we converted power plants, if we went to natural gas as a transportation fuel for a minimal amount of cost, we could meet the Kyoto Protocol, and so everyone was cool. Then along came the Paris Accord, which was much harsher, and I thought, gee, that's going to be harder to reach. And then pretty soon we said, well, we got to drop fossil fuel altogether. And I began to look at it in more detail, and that's when no one was talking about the costs. And it appeared to me that it would destroy our society if we did that. As we came up with, it would take half of our GDP to meet this thing, and our lifestyles would be dramatically changed. And you look at the rate of currency. For us to put all this in, we have to send half of our money to China and get their equipment and put it in. Then what do we do the next year? We don't have any. We got to get their money back, and so we'd have to sell more agriculture land if we passed laws to do this. So yes, and it became a mission for me, and it was, to me, I'll be honest, it was a spiritual mission, shall we say. And people laugh when I say that because I'm kind of been the black sheep most of my life. But anyway, so much for that. And it's we followed a very similar path, and I began to question things. And you notice in our movie, I questioned the hurricanes, we questioned the tornado, the other things, and I began to look at this like you would a lawyer looking at a case. You find the flaws. Anyway, it was a conversation, and thank you for coming to add to this. And my path was very similar to yours.
Okay, well, around 2005, I started engaging in the public debate on climate change. Before that, I just ignored it. I said, oh, that's politics. You know, I'm a scientist. I should just ignore it. But I began engaging around 2005. And what I was concerned about was overconfidence in the IPCC assessment report. I was concerned about the activism, political activism of, leading climate scientists. And I was concerned about just general oversimplification of the problem and the trust that was being put into climate models with, very inadequate justification. So I was concerned about, and I was also becoming more aware of the technical skeptics blogosphere, people who were challenging things like the hockey stick with, very strong arguments, deep dives into the data, advanced statistical analysis methods and everything. And the establishment was, claiming these people were the Antichrist, and they were doing, a real scientific service. So I became very concerned about the behavior of the community and the oversimplification of the problem. So I came at it from that direction rather than from the direction of energy policy, although in later years I've become much more engaged in energy policy issues. So it's just that we've oversimplified both the problem and the solution by orders of magnitude. And we've come to a very bad place where we're making stupid decisions about energy policy and other policies.
Dr. Curry, were you surprised as you were on this journey that the kind of, I don't know if the word would be canceling, but the lack of real honest conversation, scientific dialogue about this, and that it sounds like we're attempting to have that dialogue. Were you surprised at the reaction that you were getting from people?
Yes and no, but I've come to understand it over the last 15 years. I mean, basically from the very beginning, the policy cart has been way out in front of the scientific horse on this issue. I mean, back in the 1980s, the UN Environmental Program had an agenda to get rid of fossil fuels. They were anti-capitalist. They were looking for, this whole global thing, and they latched onto the climate change issue. And in partnership with a few well-placed activist climate scientists, I mean, even in the late 80s, they were talking about getting rid of fossil fuels and aggressive timetables for doing this. This is before there was even any warming to speak of. They'd seen a small amount of warming in the 1980s. So, this situation was out there, and the whole strategy was speaking scientific consensus to power. They felt they needed a scientific consensus, or a consensus among scientists to support their agenda, which is where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, came in. So there was this speaking consensus to power strategy. And anybody who challenged the consensus, like me, talking about uncertainty, or say, there's lots of disagreement and all these kind of things, that's then I was labeled a heretic and worse. So I was interfering with this speaking consensus to power strategy that was put in place. And it's a very political strategy, that really cherry picks and marginalizes science in all this, but uses the overall reputation of science to support their politics. And a lot, and it became very lucrative for scientists just to go along with this in terms of getting, for their reputation, for getting media attention, government grants, promotions, big institutes, and so forth and so on. So if you wanted to advance in your career as a climate scientist, you need to go along with all this.
Wow. It's a brilliant strategy, if you think about it for a minute, because if I may, you must be a hero for millions of young women who want to enter the STEM field. You've had a remarkable career, both as student and in the academy. Remarkable. I mean, it's really something. We're so fortunate to be able to talk to you. And yet you get this sobriquet, client heretic. And it just makes me sort of wonder, like, how many dimensions of heretic are there in this? Who are you betraying exactly?
I'm betraying the dogma. This UN climate dogma. Okay, I'm saying no, this is wrong. This is a very exceedingly complex problem, just from the physical science point of view, not to mention the socio-political, economic aspects of all this, and that we need to acknowledge uncertainty, we need to acknowledge disagreement, and we need to lose this speaking consensus to power thing that the UN has put into place to support their ambitions for getting rid of fossil fuels on a very aggressive timescale. So I'm proud of the people call me other names besides heretic, deniers, misinformer, all of these other things. I don't like those, but heretic, I'm proud of that. It means I'm going against the dogma, which I most certainly am.
It's a pretty brilliant strategy for, I'm much more a student of sort of social policy and economics and business than certainly not a climate scientist at all, but it's pretty obvious to me that capitalists are not good at organizing themselves around this kind of thing. They're busy making money, running businesses, trying to get rich, trying to compete. They're busy. The people at the UN, various committees and charters and whatnot, they're really good at organizing. And I think somebody someday needs to write a book about the brilliance of co-opting science as what was the intermediary between capitalists and socialists, right? There needed to be an intermediary, and science was the one because it was objective. It was based on observable, hypothesis and testing, and then verifying results, and then making decisions based on those things. That's gone out the window.
Yeah, well, it's a political strategy to scientize the politics and politicize the science. Okay, and that's a recipe for destroying science and making bad policy decisions. It's all in, that there's a worldview out there, opposed to the capitalist, human flourishing kind of, let's move the frontiers of human development forward versus, more of an environmental, too many people on the planet, people are the enemies, all of this kind of, it's a worldview that, a globalization and just more of an environmental centric, and that people are the blight kind of worldview that the UN seems to hold. So you've got two different worldviews. This is a clash, of two big worldviews. And since prosperity and human flourishing and thriving is on the side of the more, what I would say, the more capitalist worldview, I think that one will win out in the end. But it's a very painful process trying to deal with this issue of climate change in a sensible way with the dominance of that worldview. And they claim the moral high ground. Well, it's not the moral high ground when you're allowing half the world's population no access to grid electricity because you're worried about CO2 emissions.
Right.
Or you're digging cobalt with your fingers
Right.
in an open pit mine somewhere, in Central Africa, or trying to grow crops without basic tools, the noble savage concept. I think I heard you refer to this, and I might be crossing circuits a little bit, but as green colonialization and energy apartheid. Those are brandable words.
Yeah, green colonialism and energy apartheid. To me, they're very apt. I did not come up with those phrases. There's a lot of great leaders in this area from within Africa, well-educated people, very smart, outspoken, articulate, who I think can help turn the corner for that continent. But I'm happy to amplify their message whenever and wherever I can.
Dave, I wanted to go back and just address this term capitalism, because words matter. And capitalism, I think a number of young people have been taught that capitalism is bad. Well, what you described, people creating businesses, trading value for value without government coercion, that is good. That's what has been great about America and why people have come to America, because they have this opportunity to create value for value and trade that and become financially successful. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what many people, I think is capitalism is actually cronyism. And that's when you end up having business, government, bureaucrats, all of them getting in bed with each other and then using all that policy to push forward an agenda. And so I really think it's important that we make that distinction so that we are sure that we're getting our terminology right, because capitalism isn't bad, but that is the one thing that is under attack, and that's our free markets and
maybe free markets is almost a better term than capitalism for what we're talking about here. And it's really about freedom in a broad sense and including free markets. So it's maybe even better not to use the C word, just talk about freedom and free markets. And that's what we're really talking about.
Well, and the other thing, Dr. Curry, and what I've deduced is that the green and the green agenda is about green, but it's a lot of green that's going into a lot of different pockets.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's big business at this point. Yeah, it's big business at this point. It's just that there's so many, over the last few decades, there's just been a positive feedback where all of these things are amplifying each other and getting more and more entrenched. But at the end of the day, we're spending so much money and so much effort on things that make no sense and are not advancing human well-being, and they're even acting counter to human well-being in many instances. And this is becoming more and more evident as time goes on.
Well, and Dave, that's one of the things that I think that, we've really learned in this, and Walt as well, is that this whole agenda is anti-human flourishing. And for people that value human beings, it's hard for folks to really understand that that's what's on the table, Dave.
It's impossible. It goes against everything that allowed human tribes to function. This interdependency and codependency that we have on each other, this reliance that we need to have on each other, which is based on the idea that we all have common needs and we all have common desires. And yet, it does seem to be effective to use the crisis concepts as a way to break through the more rational decision paradigms. So how do we solve problems? So how quickly does California, for example, where I live, want to go to an all electric car mandate? And what are they thinking in terms of the movement of goods and services that now happen with semi-tractor trailers? How is that going to be accomplished? So we've begun a transition, an energy transition to an unreliable, expensive, dangerous, crazy, geopolitical, uncertainty-making set of dynamics that are really designed, I think, ultimately to transfer wealth from the United States and other developed Western countries to countries of the United Nations. Am I the only person who observes that? I know I'm the non-scientist here.
Well, let me bring up my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. Part 3 is about risk and response. I mean, we failed to properly assess the climate risk, not to mention the risks associated with the proposed solutions, which are primarily getting rid of fossil fuels and wholesale into wind and solar. We have not adequately assessed those risks. And until we do that, all of these, net zero targets and what California and New York is now setting up to do make absolutely no sense and are basically going to, destroy their economies. We're seeing this happen in Europe. I mean, with Germany being the prime poster child for they've completely destroyed their industrial and manufacturing economy. And as a result of getting rid of nuclear power and trying to transition away from gas, they're ending up having to burn more and more coal. So they're not reducing their carbon footprint. Their energy costs have skyrocketed, and there's not sufficient abundance, to support data centers or, big industry. And this is happening all over Europe. And it's not just with energy, it's with food, cow farts and fertilizer and all this kind of stuff. The Netherlands, which produces a huge percentage of the food for Europe. Hard to believe that since it's such a tiny country, but they're being extremely aggressive, culling all the livestock herds, restricting production of fertilizer and all this. And you've seen huge demonstrations in the Netherlands, from farmers and whatever. And they're going to, so first they've choked off the energy supply. Now they're choking off the food supply, all in the interest of decreasing the CO2 in the atmosphere by a minuscule amount, which isn't going to change the climate or extreme weather. I mean, this is worse than tulip mania. If you recall what that was, just think something that people latch onto. It makes absolutely no sense.
Well, and Walt, that's one of the things that you really wanted to bring out in a climate conversation documentary is the costs. What is this exactly?
Actually, we've done a lot of discussion on the cost, and Ken Gregory was probably underestimating things because he did not include the extra transmission lines we got to have, or the cost of recycling this stuff. There are a lot of hazardous waste in these materials.
Okay. Well, it's worse than that. It's worse than that because wind and solar and even batteries, that's asynchronous power. You can't maintain grid frequency with a predominance of asynchronous power. In order to do that, you have to jazz up the transmission lines with all sorts of expensive technologies. It's not just the amount of transmission. You have to have transmission that will accommodate asynchronous power sources, and this is underappreciated. I mean, people, when they evaluate this, they just look at the generation of the power. Oh, wind and solar, but they don't talk about the cost of the infrastructure for power generation or the transmission or the technical hurdles. Nobody has demonstrated that you can produce 90% or more power from wind and solar. People say, oh, this or that country, Iceland or whatever, is producing 98% of their power from renewable energy. Well, that's because they have abundant hydropower. Okay, that's the only way, or geothermal. That's the only way they're able to do it, not with wind and solar. So how everybody has drunk the Kool-Aid on wind and solar. And then the crazy thing is that the one really good solution, if you will, is nuclear power. And the green people hate nuclear worse than they hate fossil fuels. The UN is coming around to saying, okay, well, nuclear is okay. Finally, in the last year, all of a sudden, nuclear is okay after everybody's gone around and decommissioned their nuclear power plants, which is the stupidest thing they could have done. So, this is just mass stupidity. It makes no sense. And this is why I emphasize the risk assessment that needs to be done. And then once you understand the nature of the risk and the uncertainties, then you can figure out how you want to manage it. And just trying to manage it by the precautionary principle, get rid of all fossil fuels as soon as you can. I mean, that's a really bad strategy given the nature of this, the complexity and uncertainty surrounding this particular problem.
Wow.
How republics turn into empires. When you get a decision-making paradigm like the one we have now, you can sort of see do you want Marcus Aurelius to reemerge and bring some sanity to the entire thing? Because, yes, decommissioning nuclear power. I live in California. I just got a note in the mail yesterday that water rates are going up again. Water rates go up every day in California. And, when I moved here to go to school at Berkeley, it was a long time ago, there were 18 million people here, and we had a water infrastructure. Now there's 40 million people, and we have the same water infrastructure. But then there were two parties. Now there's one. And partly because of that, we just closed 4 hydroelectric dam facilities that were not only producing electricity for tens of thousands of people, but were producing water for people in California. Arguably, these are the two things we need the most to have a normal modern life. Reducing those, eliminating those, and putting mandates on fossil fuels that are extraordinarily high. Now, here in Marin County, we seem to be able to afford Teslas. I've got one, and I love it. I got to tell you, there's a lot about them. I feel a little bad since I met Ron Stein, who's in the movie, who's got moral objections, and I didn't know anything about those. I just wanted to get an exciting new car that goes really fast, which it does. In retrospect, I'm starting to think maybe, I might be part of the problem. But in any event, we have a decision-making process driven by the concept of crisis. It's just like COVID, right? Just like COVID, it was a non-scientific response to a not well understood problem filled with uncertainties that were not even examined. And it sounds like your book when I say it that way.
Yeah, actually, chapter 12, decision making under deep uncertainty, gives a bunch of different decision making frameworks for dealing with complex, wicked problems where there's a lot of uncertainty and people disagree. I mean, there's no regret solutions. There's dynamic adaptation where you take baby steps and you work on human-sized problems rather than thinking you're going to change the global climate. So there's lots of strategies that you can use that are win-win for this kind of a problem. But again, if your prima facie goal is to get rid of fossil fuels, like the UN decided in the 1980s, well, then they're not interested in that. They just want to get rid of fossil fuels. Who cares about poverty, food shortages, energy shortages, no industrial development, and no human flourishing? Well, we've gotten rid of fossil fuels, and they'll probably cull the global population in the process. But the irony is that destroying the environment, if you start burning wood, I mean, that's the quickest way to trash your environment. So, it's just, it's a religion, that does not have a logical or scientific foundation. And it's taken us to a very bad place. That's why I'm proud to be a heretic, calling, no, this is wrong.
Well, you're a heretic who's adding significantly to the volume of this pilgrim's knowledge and tool set when it comes to having conversations. Like this concept that I've heard you say, I've not heard others say, slow creep. And I believe I saw you in a podcast where you talked about the sea level rise of 3 millimeters a year. I think that's what it is. And you made an example of what they did in Holland 800 years ago or something, of adapting with stone tools. So how did we lose this idea of adaptation in favor of crisis management, do you think?
Well, the whole issue of sea level rise, and once you separate out the extreme weather events that basically have little to nothing to do with global warming, I mean, you're left with the slow creep of warming, which contributes to sea level rise and melting of glaciers. I mean, these are slow processes. 3 millimeters per year. If you stack 2 pennies on top of each other, that's 3 millimeters. Well, sure, if you take 10 years or 100 years, I mean, it does add up, but it's still a very small amount. With regards to the Netherlands, much of that country is 7 feet below sea level, and over the centuries, they have, fortified their coastline quite effectively. And, the Dutch have really engineered almost every square mile of their country in some way. They're pretty amazing. I mean, this tiny country is producing most of the food for Europe. But there are ways of, dealing with it. There's so much variability in local sea level rise. It can be caused by ocean circulation patterns. It can be caused by local sinking, caused by geologic processes or withdrawal of groundwater. In Louisiana, where sea level is rising very quickly, a lot of it has to do with their extraction of oil and gas from the land, which causes it to sink. Building big cities compresses the soil, which causes subsidence also. So there's a bunch of factors that relate to, any place where sea level rise is a problem. For the most part, it's sinking of the land. That's a bigger issue than the actual slow creep of the sea level rise. So, and that's been completely misrepresented to the public.
This is too, if I let me jump in here, because this is too delicious a thing. This word creep reminds me of John Kerry. Maybe I shouldn't say it that way, but I've seen his house in Nantucket Island. And I don't know if anyone else here has been in Nantucket or seen his house. This thing is beyond belief. It's just one of the great mansions of America, of the world.
Dave, if I could,
literally on the water. And Obama's property, I think it's 35 acres, is on the ocean.
Right on the ocean.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about Obama is apparently they have a 5,000 gallon propane tank to protect them from any power insufficiencies caused by wind and solar. So, it's massive hypocrisy from these people.
It is.
if I could chime in once on the Dutch here, the Netherlands, that is the birthplace of capitalism, as they say. The Dutch East Indies companies, and at one time, the Rhine River was just filled with logs coming from the Black Forest down to help them build their dams, ships, dikes, and they were very innovative in taking their situation and making it better. And I think that's something we all need to learn from.
Yeah. Good point.
But the innovation and creativity, if we actually really used that, then these powers that be would not have the control that they have. So that's why I don't think they want to get serious about using creativity and innovation for any of these challenges that we have, Dr. Curry.
Well, the biggest thing we need for creativity and innovation is an ample and adequate supply of cheap energy, electricity. All of these things, we can engineer our environment, all these data centers and blockchain, artificial intelligence and quantum, this and that, which is going to really support our progress in the 21st century, relies on a huge amount of electricity. And where is that going to come from? It's not going to come from wind and solar. By thinking that it is, we're just tying a tourniquet around our neck, and we're going to stymie any chance for thriving and flourishing in the 21st century. So we just need to get over it and put energy front and center. We need a lot, and it needs to be inexpensive, reliable, and secure. I hope there's new technologies. I hope there's better technologies than fossil fuels coming down the horizon. But for right now, fossil fuels is pretty much, the best thing that we have that's readily available.
Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I just think the irony is so rich, because I know we do spend some public money on developing and looking into things like fusion reactors and shrinking the size of nuclear power to be a more distributed network, and therefore a safer network. But you think about the money that we're spending, the hundreds of billions of dollars of public money on a solution that does not appear to be economic or reliable, or even conceivable. Or where are we going to get all of these rare earths?
Yeah, I think the new developments in nuclear power are extremely exciting. I'm very optimistic that, if we look ahead to 2100, I think we're going to see a predominance of nuclear power. The new advanced geothermal energy technologies look pretty interesting. But wind and solar, to me, I think there's a role for rooftop solar. People like the autonomy of having, a local power source and batteries that they have control over. But I think wind is a very small niche solution, and solar farms. And the other irony of having weather dependent power supply is that the reason we're doing this in the first place is because people think climate change causes bad weather. So why should we subject our hydropower and our wind power and our solar power to bad weather, to forest fires, to hurricanes, droughts, the whole works? Why have our power supply susceptible to the vagaries of weather and climate? It just defies logic.
It does defy logic. And Walt, you and I are in Colorado, and we just finished up this legislative session. But we really had, I think, a couple of bills that I'd call them the shakedown of the oil and gas industry. And I think you probably were watching those as well, Walt.
I look at that in detail, and I get more and more information from it. Oil companies themselves compete against each other. And you look at that's the big companies coming in, and they make some sort of agreement. And I think they're going to push the little guys out of business more. And that's kind of interesting, because one part of the oil and gas business will compete and try to squish another part of the oil and gas industry. And I think that's part of it too.
Well, that doesn't, surprise me. Things like that are probably going to happen. And when they get too far out of line, then new upstarts will pop up again. So it's just part of the way business gets done. And I don't think that's entirely unhealthy. But it's when it's government enforced, monopolies and this, that, and the other. It's too tightly regulated by the government. I think that's when we get in trouble.
There seems to be no shortage of trouble. I believe the strategic oil reserve, which sometime in the last few years became the tactical oil reserve, the politically tactical oil reserve. I think it's down to 18% now in 4 years from near 100. I don't know how high it got, but it was full essentially, and now empty because in an effort to reduce energy costs, particularly gasoline costs at the pump.
Well, there'll be all sorts of political games over the next 6 months, before the U.S. presidential election. And I'm sure the Petroleum Reserve will be one of them. Release everything you've got to try to lower gasoline prices before the election.
Do deals with Venezuela and some of our less friendly neighbors, not neighbors, but in the Middle East. And we seem to have lost our patriotism somewhere here along the way. And I'm not a jingoist or a chauvinist, or I don't have an ist, capitalist, I suppose. But I do think there's room for patriotism in human flourishing. It causes societies to function better together when people have a common set of values that they harbor around and that they rely upon. We seem to have lost some of that.
Yeah,
and this climate change appears to be just one tool of breaking it apart.
Well, the way I look at it is a little bit different, is that the diversity of the different states in the U.S. with different values and different politics basically provide a laboratory for trying different things. And, so then overall we can see what works, and people can, move around to where their values are shared. There's a huge diversity of values, and we just sort of need to acknowledge that and figure out how to operate in a sensible way where smaller groups can secure their common interests under this larger umbrella, of our country, where, that, is to protect all of us, and sort of putting patriotism first above, their local common self-interest isn't going to be appealing for a lot of people. It will be appealing for billionaires, but for people who are struggling and, who have a different perspective, it's going to be the local and the personal that is primary. So, and I think that's one of the strengths of our country, is that we allow for the great diversity of perspectives. And the states, California is doing, one experiment, Texas is doing another one, Montana is doing, yet another one. Everybody's trying something different, and matches their local values, and one of them may emerge as, okay, this is really the way forward. So I think it's really a strength, the fact that we have disagreement and different values and the opportunity to try a lot of different things. Sort of a different take on it.
Yeah, Dr. Curry, I think that's such an excellent point. And I think that really was part of the American ideas, all these different states, petri dishes on ideas. I think the concern is that there's also personal responsibility, if you will. If California is off the rails and they make poor choices, or Colorado's off the rails and make poor choices, it's not fair then to go to the federal government to bail out those poor choices, because there are states that's been making good choices. And so I think that's something people need to understand.
Yeah, the balance, that's politics. There's no simple solution to that one. And the political winds change as we've seen. So
they do. Walt, I know that there's some other things that's on your mind. What's a couple of the things you wanted to talk with Dr. Curry about?
Well, I wanted to bring up the error in the all the estimates of how the Earth's temperature is going to change. All these algorithms are really bad, as it turns out. And there are probably maybe 20 teams of scientists putting together their proprietary algorithms, and they're all off by a factor of 3, and no one changes anything. And when I look at things, when the Earth had a lot of CO2 and a lot of warmth, which was back in the Mississippian era, we deposited a lot of limestone. You put CO2 in the atmosphere, it's not static, it can come out. the CO2 can come out as calcium carbonate in limestones. And you see a lot of that in the Mississippian area. And I just wonder if they're not taking into consideration that CO2 is not a static molecule.
Okay, well, the more sophisticated Earth system models do include carbon cycle, both the short carbon cycle, both the land and the ocean, not necessarily the very long carbon cycle kind of issues where you form, limestone. But those models are in their infancy, and there's a lot of disagreement among them. Climate models, they're tools for helping us understand how the climate systems work. They're very poor at making predictions because, they don't accurately account for the natural climate variability. They certainly don't know how to predict solar variations or volcanic eruptions. They do an inadequate job at predicting the long timescale oscillations in the ocean, and they don't get important aspects of the carbon cycle right. Even on smaller timescales, they really don't get clouds right. So there's so many things, and the most basic thing, the sensitivity of the climate to a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide. You think that's the most basic thing? There's at least a factor of 3 disagreement on this, whether it's low or high, even within the IPCC reports. It's something that we don't know. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a big range. If it's on the low end, we don't need to worry about this at all. If it's on the high end, it could be a big problem. But I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests it's on the low end. But there's a lot of disagreement about this. So thinking that we can predict, like we're going to exceed this carbon threshold by 2050 or exceed the 2-degree warming threshold by whatever time. All of those are political statements. They're not supported by science in any kind of a meaningful way.
Thank you.
I got a question here. I don't know if you've ever met or spoken with Patrick Moore. One of the great hours I've spent in my life was talking to him for an hour. What a fascinating individual, and what a great backstory he has had. And he has, I don't know if you mentioned it, but he has this universal theory of scary stuff, which is a perfectly him idea that you want to make sure scary stuff is something that you can never actually see or visit. So you can't see the trash thing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You can't, who's going to go and count polar bears, right? Not only difficult to do, dangerous work, right? So how does this get mitigated?
Well, it's a psychology of risk perception, and I deal with this in chapter 10 of my book. Paul Slovic and Daniel Kahneman, these are economists and social psychologists who have studied perception of risk. And things that seem scary to us are things that are outside of our normal experience. The biggest risk that any of us faces on a day-to-day basis is probably getting hit by a car. Okay, but it's not something, but it's normal. We don't worry about that one. Instead, we worry about things like nuclear power, which are exceedingly safe, and things like that. So if it's something that's far away and it's human caused or it's hard to understand, these things seem scarier than any objective risk analysis would show. And so the climate propagandists, take advantage of this. And if something's immediate, people are more worried about it than something, 100 years in the future. So the climate propagandists take full advantage of these things, talking about extreme weather events rather than the slow creep of sea level rise, for example. And, that it's man-made and not natural, that makes it sound scarier. That the risks are mostly borne by the poorest people. That makes that riles up our moral sense. So there's all these little tricks that get played, as part of the whole propaganda machine to try to scare people and key on our psychological perceptions of risk. So this is, the literature's out there on that. And my book explains, what's going on there. But yeah, no, they're very clever at doing this, something that is much worse, seems much worse than it actually is.
Yeah, I do find it fascinating. There never is a feedback loop. I'm trying to remember what year Kevin Bacon predicted the oceans would die. And it's accepted by many people that we are in a mass extinction, not heading for one, in it now. And yet the sort of body count of animals and life on Earth seems to the opposite. And instead of desertification of the Earth is notably greener, as CO2 concentrations have increased. And so these are the biggest lies that because they're really, truly global, right?
Yeah, well, okay, I have to put on my old-fashioned environmentalist hat here. I mean, there are land use issues and things that we do to trash our environment that harm species environments. So it's really more related to land use. The actual warming, irresponsible land use, the actual warming and the enriching of CO2 and more rainfall. I mean, this is all good for ecosystems. But, if humans are causing problems with ecosystems, it's really more through land use and what we're doing to the oceans rather than CO2 emissions.
So that is the point. I think I've heard you talk about fake problems. I wouldn't want to suggest that overfishing is a fake problem. It seems to me it is an extraordinarily real problem. And turning the Colorado River, was it the Colorado they turned yellow? The EPA turned yellow a few years ago.
That was
right by you guys, right?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Real problem. You can't turn the river yellow. I mean, you just can't, right? But that's not climate change. So, I think you had an expression. I wrote it down because I wanted to say it. Think harder, compete less. I think that might be your brand. I think that you might have coined that.
No, I didn't coin it. I think it was Kerry Emanuel, who's an atmospheric scientist. I think he was saying basically with regards to climate science, we're relying too much on the models and we're not actually thinking, looking at the data and developing theories. And I agree with him 100%. So we're raising a whole generation of scientists who analyze the outputs of climate models without understanding anything, without contributing to our knowledge base of how the climate systems work. And I think, Kerry Emanuel's point, and I wholeheartedly agree with him on this, is that we've lost a generation of climate dynamicists because people aren't being trained in the fundamentals of fluid dynamics and whatever, that they need to understand the dynamics of the climate system. And all they're doing is analyzing the output of climate models, to find alarming things. Oh, we won't be able to grow grapes in California. There goes the wine industry. That kind of analysis. That's really not very meaningful. So, we're not thinking. I mean, we're just turning the crank. We've made a lot of bad assumptions. We're dotting the I's and crossing the T's on those assumptions. And nobody's stepping back to really think. And this is what I tried to do in my book, a rethinking the nature of the risk and how we should respond.
When I was a kid, my father would say, or my mother would say, put your thinking cap on. So I think we need to put our thinking caps on. Walt, your final thoughts. This has been just terrific.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Curry, for your input. I appreciate to put this in with all the other conversations we've had. I think it's good for people to hear you. And you are eminently qualified to be making these statements you have, and they reimburse a lot of my thinking. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. I've enjoyed talking with you.
And Dave, your final thought?
Well, my first, as I often say with these, my final thought is gratitude for the heretics of the world, and for, let's face it, it takes some courage to withstand the slings and arrows that are out there. And I think Academy has lost a star, but maybe the world has gained a hero or a heroine. I find your work incredibly valuable, and your personal story incredibly inspiring. More Judith Curry is good for the world, and I hope it's good for Judith Curry too.
Well, thank you. I'm doing okay.
And Dr. Curry, your final thought that you'd like to leave with everyone?
I guess I want to close on a note of optimism. I mean, things are better now in the early 21st century than they have ever been, in human history. Poverty is way down. Agricultural productivity is way up. Population has increased dramatically, with a much smaller fraction of those people in poverty. A fewer percent of people are losing their lives from extreme weather and climate events. I mean, things are looking very good. And so we have a path forward for prosperity, flourishing, thriving in the 21st century. But we need to sort of stop the gloom and doom about climate change and make sure we have plenty of electricity and energy that can support all the exciting things that are going to lead us forward into the 21st century.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you. So thanks, Walt. Thanks, Dave. And thank you, Dr. Curry.
Thank you.